Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Remixing Politics and Culture with me, your host, Pam. I am a public relations and marketing professional with a passion for social justice, voter advocacy, and culture. And tonight we have a special show in that we're doing a virtual town hall. And I encourage you all to participate, please, in the chat. You can participate just by texting or whatnot, or I do have a link to the StreamYard so that you can come on stage if you'd like to make a comment or what have you. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the unraveling of civil rights here in America. I'm alarmed. I hope you are too. And you should be. Literally, almost every week, we hear of something, of some court changing some rule or law or way of life that we have known it to be. And it's quite upsetting the norms of everyday American life. A couple of years ago, the Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was essentially gutted. And I really cannot remember, can you, the last time anybody has mentioned anything about the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which came about to restore the Voting Rights Act of 65 that was gutted by the Supreme Court. Go figure. The Dobbs decision, that sent shockwaves throughout the country, throughout the world, really. It took away a woman's ability to choose. It took away the autonomy of our own health care. More recently, there was a woman in Texas, in fact, that because of the Texas law of not being able to have an abortion for her own health care, she became septic, and now she can no longer have children. So these decisions do have very dire consequences. And most recently, in fact, the Chevron case, whereby our federal agencies that we depend upon to take care of regulations such for our food, air, water, corporate issues or whatnot, that is the norm of our government setup. The Supreme Court says, nah, you don't really need all those experts. We don't really need all of that, that level of checks and balances for our corporations to do right by us. Well, the rich and the poor alike and people of all ethnicities have to eat. We care about our environment and all of that. But I guess the dollar is more important. Go figure, right? So my distinguished guests are coming on here tonight to discuss the times that we're living in and the rights that are being eroded right before our eyes. And my first guest that I was going to introduce first isn't here. So I am going to introduce Trevor Coleman. All right. Hey, Trevor. Trevor is a C-suite speechwriter, author, strategic communications expert, and a national award-winning multimedia journalist. For nearly a decade, Trevor served as Director of Communications for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. He is certified in cultural competency trainer and received the Michigan Department of Civil Rights Distinguished Service Award in 2009. He has co-authored 4 college textbooks and co-authored the award-winning biography of the late, great civil rights icon, Judge Damon Keith of Detroit. Currently, Trevor is the executive speechwriter for the Office of Attorney General of New York State, Letitia James. So every time I think about her, Trevor, I always think about how she commands her speeches and what have you. So now I totally understand why. Welcome to the show, Trevor.
Oh, thank you very much, Pam.
All right. And next up, I have Professor Jerry Gershenhorn, who is a recent retiree from North Carolina Central University, where he was the Julius L. Chambers Professor of History. He specializes in 20th century United States history, African American history, North Carolina history, and media history. He taught at North Carolina Central for 29 years. Jerry, why didn't you even make it to 30? Even 30.
Maybe I should have.
He is the author of 2 books, Melville J. Herskovitz and the Racial Politics of Knowledge, and the award-winning book, Lewis Austin in the Carolina Times, A Life in the Long Black Freedom Struggle. Professor Gershenhorn has written numerous articles on African American history. Welcome back to the show, Professor Jerry.
Thank you so much, Pam. It's good to be with you.
Yes, it's good to have you back. And last but certainly not least, he is my favorite Gen Zer, Greer Webb. Greer is a phenomenal young man. He is a scholar, having been a Kane Moorhead Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is currently on a full scholarship at Emory University School of Law, where he is now officially a 2L, having completed successfully his first year of law school. Greer is currently a legal intern with the Federal Defender Program Incorporated, which is a criminal indigent defense group. Greer is a much sought after commentator and speaker. Welcome back to the show, Greer.
Thanks so much for having me, Pam.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're one of my faves.
Well, I always love it. I always love it and appreciate it when you call me your favorite Gen Zer, because you're one of few who really put the respect on our name that is deserved. So
that's right. Listen, we are all counting. Listen, all of us gray heads here are all depending on you all for the future, right? So let's get our discussion started. Okay, Johnny Morant. Yes, hey Johnny, thank you. All right. Okay, so Professor, being that you are indeed the historian among us, please start us off with what happened literally 60 years ago. Oh my, can you believe that? 60 years ago, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah, as you say, the Civil Rights Act of 64 was actually signed by President Johnson on July 2nd. So we're having the 60th anniversary coming up this coming week. Mm-hmm. And I'll just talk a little bit about, the main provisions of the act and some of the history of what happened subsequent to that legislation being passed. Mm-hmm. So the main things are it banned racial segregation in public facilities, like restaurants, hotels, and the like. It also put some teeth behind public school integration. 10 years prior to that, in 1954, of course, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was, deemed by the U.S. Supreme Court that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. But very little had happened. Most of the schools in the South were still segregated. Mm-hmm. So under Title IV of the Civil Rights Act, this permitted the Attorney General of the United States to file lawsuits against school districts to integrate those schools. And also under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, there was a broader provision that said that any entity, which could be like a corporation or a county government, a state government, any entity that received federal funds could not discriminate based on race. And if they did, those funds could be taken away from them. So that was very important as well. And then Title VII was about equal employment opportunity. So it said that it banned discrimination in employment based on race and sex and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Mm-hmm. All of those provisions continued to be used today. So just quickly, in terms of Title II, banning racial segregation in public facilities, although in some places, some of these facilities had already integrated because of the civil rights movement, protests, sit-ins, and the like, still many were not. And it didn't happen overnight in many cases. And there was one black journalist from Florida who drove around the South about, I think it was 6 or 8, maybe 10 weeks after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And he went to various restaurants and hotels and saw, if they were truly desegregated. And in, in North Carolina, there were still places that weren't, but it was better than, say, in Mississippi, which probably wouldn't, surprise anyone.
No.
And many of you may have seen Reggie Jackson, the great baseball player, give an interview recently down in Birmingham. And in 1967, he was playing in the minor league in Birmingham, Alabama, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And it just shows you, and he talked about the horrible treatment he received. He was constantly called the N-word by restaurant owners, hotel owners, and they would not allow him to use their facilities 3 years after the Civil Rights Act. So it wasn't like everyone immediately desegregated. In terms of Title VII, one of the most important components, employment opportunity, equal employment opportunity based on race and sex. Once again, businesses, corporations did not desegregate. Here in North Carolina, prior to 1964, the paper mill industry, the furniture industry, and the textile industry, the biggest one in North Carolina, they essentially did not hire black workers except for the most menial positions. And as you can imagine, corporations didn't immediately desegregate. What had to happen was NAACP attorneys and black workers had to file suit. Julius Chambers, many of you may be familiar with, was very prominent in a number of cases, suing Duke Power and other corporations to finally get desegregation. And there was tremendous resistance. I mean, there was one or more cases where it not only required that black employees be hired and promoted without regard to race, but it also required desegregation of the factories, if that was a factory, their facilities. And in a lot of cases, so say the factory had a locker room and a cafeteria, there were cases where white employees actually boycotted the facilities because they did not want to eat in a cafeteria with black employees. One case, at least, until the 1990s, that white employees, kind of shot themselves in the foot. They wouldn't eat in the cafeteria, whereas black employees would, just because they refused. And this was probably a next generation, 25, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. Title IV was about public school integration. I came across an article by Dr. King. He wrote in 1964, published in the Atlantic Monthly, and he was talking about how so few schools were desegregated. He said in Atlanta, of course, where he was based, that less than 1% of black students were in desegregated high schools, and no black students were in desegregated elementary schools at that time, 10 years after the Brown decision.
Professor Gershenhorn, I want to comment there. I moved here to North Carolina in 1990 from Detroit, Michigan. And when I moved here, I remember them saying, oh, the schools it's going to be called Durham County Schools. Oh, no, Durham Public Schools. I'm sorry. No longer Durham City and Durham County. And I came from Detroit. So Durham is like, is this really a city to me? Because it's so small, right? I consider it a town. Right, Greer? Let me tell you, it took me a while to understand what they were saying, that it was so that the city schools were where the black kids went and the county schools were where the white kids went. And I was like, it was 1990. It was something. It was really weird. It was
I had moved to Durham about a year before that. And I recall that, very vividly. And all of the historically black, historically white high school for Durham City was Durham High School.
Right.
Now Durham School of the Arts.
Right.
And by 1990, that school was almost 100% black because you had white flight. Many of the white families left the city, or they went to, these private schools. since that time. Sometimes they call them segregation academies because many of them were created to perpetuate segregation. So that's absolutely the case, that you had a resegregation after you did get substantial integration. In North Carolina, you did get some substantial integration by 1968. And then in the early 70s, the probably well-known case of Julius Chambers went before the Supreme Court and won in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, which led to busing of students from city to county and county to city. So in Charlotte Mecklenburg, you had, Charlotte City was predominantly black, and Mecklenburg County, like Durham County, as you mentioned, was predominantly white. So they paired city and county schools and would bus black students and white students sort of both ways. Some of the black students would go to the county, some white students would go to the city, and that type of thing. And then finally, just to mention that the Title VI deals with schools, but it also deals, this is the one that says the federal government can withdraw federal funds from these entities that discriminate. And so this has been used very much, not just with regard to schools, but say you have a county or a police department, for example, that has racial discrimination, either against black police officers or in terms of, racial profiling, police brutality, of course, we all know about. They can be sued by the federal government, or even without being sued. The federal government can come in and say, if you continue to operate in this fashion, we will withdraw federal funds. So sometimes the federal government can get changes even without going through kind of a protracted lawsuit. And then environmental justice as well is another area. If you have counties that are, putting toxic dumps in, black and brown neighborhoods or near them, or if you have contaminated water supplies in minority, areas, the federal government once again can come in under Title VI. So this is
not so more now with the Chevron case that just got passed here at the Supreme Court. I mean, because it's supposed to be, it's confusing, but from what I'm understanding, that's going to be dealing with a lot of regulation. Let me bring up our other guest is here, Ms. KL Newhouse. Let me bring her up. Hello, KL.
Hello there, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with you. My laptop forced an update at, of course, the most inconvenient time.
Okay. So everyone, this is KL Newhouse. She's attorney KL Newhouse. She is the chief crisis, conflict, and culture strategist of New Image Communications and Mediation. She's a 25-year practitioner and subject matter expert with a robust practice portfolio in media crisis consulting, disinformation disruption, media training, and more. She is also a certified diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer. She has a forthcoming book coming out later this year on trauma, and I believe that might be autobiographical, right? All the way from the West Coast state of California. Welcome, KL, to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad again to be here with all of you distinguished individuals and all the great work that you do, and particularly on behalf of someone that I not only respect professionally, but absolutely adore, and that is Pam.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So Professor Gershenhorn has given us a really extensive background on civil rights, what happened afterwards, and the various titles. And we're going to be leaning in on you, Professor, to mix it up here with this discussion. KL, I actually have the first question for you. And in my mind, living in California, I can't help but to think about the living is easy, and maybe not so many worries about crazy legislation happening in California that may impede your rights there directly. How have you and your friends reacted to the unraveling of civil rights elsewhere, and even, on the Supreme Court level, of course, and what you've been hearing about crazy Louisiana and Alabama and all the rest of the crazy folks?
Okay, well, first of all, to your audience and to everyone that's having to listen to this gravel sound coming out of my larynx, my voice is recovering from vocal cord strain. But if
Oh.
I had any amount of opportunity to speak, I was doing this for Pam. And
Oh.
because I'm screaming at the TV and the radio and the tablets and the devices all the time. So this is a great place for me to redirect
Mhm.
all of my angst about what is actually happening on the ground.
Uh-huh.
Um, I would like to address that sort of in a multifaceted way, a multi-layered way. First of all, California, in similar ways, but not as egregious ways, is similar to Georgia. There are the major urban complexes and hubs, and then there are rural places. Now, I'm a child of California. I was born here, went to school here off and on in between other places that I relocated to and have constantly come back home. So, what I will say to you is the similarity that I am pointing out is to help people to understand that these highly ready to be eager MAGA enclaves
Mhm.
could not wait to become part of whatever this new wave of what is happening is. So, therefore, there are communities here, similar to when you get out of Atlanta in Georgia,
Mhm.
that are heavily Ku Klux Klan populated territories
In
that
California?
in California. Actually, one of the stalwart bedrock Ku Klux Klan chapters started in California. And most people couldn't even imagine that that would even be within the proximity of this state, but it is. And one of the places that it shows up, again, in referencing the fact that I wanted to address this in a multi pronged fashion, is I conduct numerous various organizations, my sorority Alpha Kappa Alpha being one, in terms of local chapter, and for other voting organizations and other media organizations. Have a I would say I very closely peel to our legislature because I'm speaking and presenting quite frequently on election and voting shifts and changes and patterns. And what I can tell you, for the last 5 years, for certainty, there has been this push which mirrors federally, but in a microcosmic manner. There's been this push to just keep tossing in little bits of the legislation that you're seeing across the country. So
Mhm.
just think of the worst things that are happening in Florida and the boilerplate language, because they're literally all just
But
using the boilerplate language that they've been paid to
mhm.
carry to each state legislature. So it's here, but what has happened is the numbers. And one of the things I say often in my presentations with respect to voting and elections and groups of people who have discontent and dismay and unhappiness about why certain things aren't happening and they don't get certain things, I need everybody to go back to elementary school. This process of elections and voting and laws, legislation, it's all about simple math. Either you have the numbers or you don't. Either you have the money or you don't. And it's good if you have numbers and money, but one of those is going to win out. And what we're seeing is how money has now become, with Citizens United, so a rollback of rights. When Citizens United happened almost 10 years ago, when the first gutting of one of the tenets of the Voting Rights Act was gutted, Section 2, that became a hotbed for money to completely obliterate politics. And so, therefore, think of California as just a baby version of some of the things you're seeing in Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and New York has the same story. I'm very connected to a number of people who are in leadership and organizations that are voter based, grassroots based, legacy organization, NAACP based, and on various commissions and committees. And what I can tell you is that we're seeing a similar like closing in on both coastlines, where there is just these step by step attempts, because these people are patient. They're strategic and they're patient. They will take what we think are L's. Oh, yay, we won the presidency. Meanwhile, those same 8 years, they were taking over every space they could in every state legislature.
Yeah, we're going to
So
talk.
we were celebrating. Some of us didn't leave inauguration and woke up and realized that there was this entire bastion of laws just starting to fall in place in every state because they're using the same boilerplate language. We saw a little bit of what that looked like where it first came into the public's visibility with when Stand Your Ground became at the forefront of most people's tongues because of when Trayvon Martin was killed. But that same template for Stand Your Ground is what's happening with book bans, with what I call body bans, because it's not just whether or not where you fall on whether a woman and her doctor and her privacy and her family have choices, but it's just where your person can be. Just assembly. One of the many things that happened with this sneak attack on Friday, where the Supreme Court decided before they leave for their summer next week that they were going to drop all these things on Friday. And as we know, being in communications, Pam, Fridays is supposed to be a dead media day. So the attempt was, let's slide all these things in that we know the public, and that ought to tell you something anyway. Why would you have to be covert about dropping all those decisions if you didn't know that you're doing something that the majority of the citizens don't agree with? So from Chevron to Oregon's case with now you can no longer sleep in public, which means that was an underhanded way to
the homeless.
criminalize being unhoused.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that in and of itself is just mind blowing. And one of our people in the chat said that he says that Gavin Newsom, his, I don't know if his opinion, I don't know the facts. He says that Gavin Newsom was one of the primary supporters of the recent SCOTUS decision to ban the homeless encampments. But I want, KL, I really appreciate your bringing us up to date on California, because I tell you, you enlighten me, because when I think of California, like I said, I always try to think that life is a little easier or something. High is everything, expensive, I can't afford it, but I think of it as more chill and not so intense or whatnot. Trevor, I want to come to you. You literally and figuratively have a front seat to history, being that you're the chief speechwriter for New York Attorney General Letitia James. I mean, so share with us your thoughts about our rights disappearing, and however you can do that without telling us all the secrets. But
well, thanks for the invitation, Pat. And I guess I should say, just as a disclaimer, I'm not speaking on behalf of the office, obviously, but
right.
I am speaking as a professional in the field of strategic communications and civil rights. And Pam, as you know, before I went into professional speech writing, which was around 2003, when I was a longtime civil rights reporter and urban affairs and education reporter. And as early as the mid 90s, I was writing about the threat of the Federalist Society. I was writing cover stories. I was writing magazine cover stories about for the NAACP Crisis magazine, for Emerge magazine. You know, Pam, you and I had.
I did some Emerge, my favorite. Yes, yeah, right. You wrote that article, Trevor. Now, see, something's happening to my memory, because that article that you wrote is my favorite, and I still have it on my bookshelf. And that's old. That came from the 90s. Yes.
Yeah. I wrote two cover stories on Clarence Thomas for Emerge magazine, where I had warned the people who I interviewed. And I interviewed, I think it was the first time Rosa Parks Rosa Parks, Ben Hooks, all the leaders, Jesse Jackson, about Clarence Thomas and how he was this mortal threat to the civil rights of the community. But Clarence Thomas was going to pretend what was happening in the future. And then around the same time, I wrote a piece for NAACP Crisis magazine about how these wealthy right-wing businesses, institutions were funding these black conservatives, these black Republicans who were like a newfangled Black Republican. There are Black Republicans who actually oppose Black people's civil rights. They oppose voting rights. They oppose police reform. I mean, they were like aggressively hostile and belligerent, like Clarence Thomas, towards their own parents, their own neighbors, their own brothers and sisters' rights as American citizens. And this was a whole new dynamic, because prior to that, in the 60s and even the 70s, you had people like Edward Brooke, and you had all these other Black Republicans who may have been conservative because they were business people, and they had, and their focus was more on economic empowerment, these sorts of things. But they saw themselves, they had a responsibility to advocate for the citizenship and for the full and equal rights of all African Americans. Now, what does this have to do with today? Because they were like Trojan horses, not necessarily for African Americans, because black folks saw that. We recognize that. We know over the course of our history, we've always had people, Black people who are grifters, who be bought up. I mean, and this was different than Black people who are conservative. We all know Black people fundamentally, culturally, religiously are conservative within how we describe conservatism. Church-going people. They may have had some views on issues like personal relationships, whether it's homosexuality, these sorts of things. But when it came to African Americans' right to vote,
right,
liberated and emancipated, there was no question which side we were on. And so the point is, these white millionaires and these white thought leaders, with the help by commission and omission of the white media. And when I say the white media, I'm talking about the New York Times, talking about the LA Times, the Washington, what most white people would call mainstream media, even though being a Black journalist, even though most of my career was obviously in mainstream media. But, but if you're a Black journalist, you're a serious Black journalist, there's a huge difference between, what the mainstream media considers mainstream and what you as a Black journalist who lives in a Black community, who was raised and immersed in that Black community, understand to be what's mainstream. In fact, when I went to the Detroit News in 1990 as urban affairs reporter, one of the first things we did there, because the paper only started hiring Black reporters in the late 80s, and there was opposition internally with white reporters whining about reverse discrimination, all this nonsense. But one of the first things we did was we created a minority source book of Black experts. So we would call people at North Carolina Central University. We call people at Morehouse and Spelman and Howard to talk about everything. I know I call people talk everything from physics, not just history, but physics to sociology to psychology, these sorts of things, because it's African Americans, who have a wider range of interest and expertise in these Black institutions in particular, that have a certain kind of sensitivity to the reality of our lives. So I guess what I'm saying here is, how do we get here with this whole unraveling of civil rights, right?
Yes.
An argument could be made. I would argue that maybe there's a little bit of self-deception, in fact, in terms of how far we actually came along. Because we may have won, like I said, we may have won the Civil War, in terms of physically, but psychologically and sociologically, the Confederacy was still very, very potent up to this moment. In fact, I would argue that the dominant politics of the moment, have more of a Confederate tinge to them. If you look and see the whole opposition to affirmative action, which is no different than after you had the civil rights, after you had the passage of the civil rights laws after the Civil War, you had the Supreme Court that was aggressively hostile with the Sullivan cases, right? Aggressively hostile. Then you had the Hayes-Tilton compromise with the legislature. And then and look at the parallels today. We cannot get the John Lewis, something basic, fundamental, that the John Lewis voting rights. Every single black Republican in Congress voted against Black people's strengthening of Black people's civil rights, voting rights. Every single one. In fact, just a month ago, Professor Gershenhart may have information. I don't have it in front of me. Just about a month or so ago, the Congress they voted to rename Confederate statutes after they were repealed a couple years ago. They voted to rename Confederate statutes, and all the Black Republicans voted to rename these to rename these Confederate statutes after the names were taken away a couple years ago. So this is the kind of mentality we're dealing with. So I guess I'll get to the point here. So when you're talking about civil rights today, in my experiences, I was a longtime civil rights reporter. I was writing about this stuff and predicting it would happen back in the 1990s. I was putting in magazines, and when I was at Detroit News, I debated the executive director of the Federalist Society, interviewed them, and even in the state of Michigan, Pam, where you're from, we had John Engler, who was this concerned governor who stacked the state courts.
Yes, he did.
Federalist Society judges, which totally distorted, turned into a Frankenstein. Became a hip. Became obviously basically an organ of the insurance industry and hostile towards civil rights and hostile towards voting rights. And so you had the same thing happen when you had, when George Bush, George H.W. Bush come in, then his son came in, and the Supreme Court basically rigged the system so his son could come in with Al Gore, and they got a chance to pack the Supreme Court. And then years later, obviously, the Republicans outmaneuver the Democrats in terms of putting these far-right extreme judges on the courts, but they specifically had to have very hostile attitudes towards African-American rights, towards civil rights. I mean, that was a litmus test. People talk about abortion being a litmus test. That was a litmus test. Hostility towards Black civil rights is a litmus test. You could not be appointed, to the federal, whether it's a district level judge, circuit court judge, the Supreme Court, if you were not aggressively, flagrantly hostile towards the civil rights of African Americans. And so now we have this Frankenstein that we're doing, which is already, as you see on Monday, they're going to release the immunity case with Trump, which was already postured, right? That if this election goes up to the Supreme Court, we already know how it's going to turn out because they're already so biased in his favor. And, that's no accident. This is part of what, Ms. Newhouse was talking about earlier. These people are systematically changing the structure, changing the infrastructure of our government without necessarily being in power of the entire government yet, but through working on a state legislation level, taking advantage of the laws the Supreme Court made available, with lobbying and basically legalizing bribes and all this sort of things, and so those of us who favor democracy and liberty, we find ourselves, behind the gun here, So the point is that, in terms of unraveling the civil rights, I don't know how tight civil rights ever was, since the end of the Civil War. I think we kind of delude ourselves. I think not delude, but I think we romanticize it.
Well, we were so relieved. I mean, it's like you have a pressure cooker on you. You're not being beat no more. You can go and halfway breathe, and so you're relieved. And we didn't get any of the economic justice. We didn't get the real things that would, it's hard to criticize because what our people went through and to get as far as we have should be celebrated.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've been giving credit where credit's due. I mean, that's not to say that there have not been qualitative changes and qualitative differences, in our life from those of our parents. All of us are probably, except for the young man, Mr. Webb here, are probably a generation born in the 60s and and maybe 50s. But the point is, though, is that there have been objective changes from the 1950s, up through the 1980s. But when it comes to materially, when we're looking at our civil rights, I remember my mother died in 1991. I remember having a conversation with her shortly before she died, and she was only 60 when she died. Having a conversation with her, and this was so 1991. George H.W. Bush was still president. His presidency was coming to an end, But if you guys remember that 1991 campaign where Clinton was running, and I was in Detroit at the time, he was running against affirmative action, and Willie Horton and all this.
Remember
Willie Horton was 88. Well, that was 88. But he was running against affirmative action. In fact, Pam, he went to your alma mater, University of Michigan.
To mention that. You went to Ohio State. See, I was trying not to mention that tonight.
Well, he went to University of Michigan, and spent the majority of his time blasting African American students right to go to the University of Michigan by attacking affirmative action. And most of the Black students stood up and turned their back on him. Right. And my mother died that October, but I remember talking to her around September when she was very ill. She died from renal failure. And she said that she felt like the times that we're living in now reminded her when she was a little girl or a young girl, a teenager in the 1940s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt horrible because here's this woman lived all these years, lived through Brown, lived under Jim Crow. She's from Virginia, right? And here she's into her life, and she's looking back on, and it felt like her in her bones,
Mm-hmm.
like we were returning back to the days of Jim Crow.
Oh my God!
And so I just felt bad, and I think about all these African Americans who were involved in the civil rights movement, who fought to break down these barriers. I wrote the biography of Judge Damon J. Keith, Crusader for Justice. Was an icon, right? And at the end of his life, he died a few years ago. He was in the 90s. He's this famous federal judge. And we had the same thing, that things were just turning back, and you see,
wow.
And I don't know if he might have died before the rejection of the John Lewis. But when John Lewis was dying, his biggest regret was that they were undermining voting rights again. Remember, they were when the last push they made when he was dying was trying to get Congress to pass it, and the Republicans told him to go to hell. We're not passing anything.
Yeah, I remember that. I do. I mean, we should all remember that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh boy. So Greer. You and I had a brief exchange online after the debate, and we're all looking to your generation to help right this ship. Of course, Gen X and the boomers, we got y'all's back, because really and truly, it should not be us versus them or generations or anything, because listen, we're all in the same ship. And what are your thoughts, Greer? I'm very curious what your thoughts are on vanishing civil rights, because I can't imagine.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Pam. I was frivolously scribbling notes over here when all of the other panelists were talking. And, I have so many thoughts, and I'll try and keep them brief because I know you have other questions. First of all, I think the point's been made, and it should be made, that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is, still sitting in Congress. What I always say also is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is also sitting there in Congress. I mean, we all saw what happened in 2020. I was out in the streets with my peers and with civil rights leaders in North Carolina. That's where I was at the time, leading protests. It was so diverse. And so we all thought there was going to be this racial reckoning, and it didn't happen. And now we see that folks on the far right and even just the right are repealing DEI and diversity efforts. And so someone put in the chat earlier that the modern day Republicans, some of them are the children of the Confederacy, or there's this mentality of let's keep up the Confederacy, let's keep to ourselves the wealth and privilege, et cetera, that keeps us in power. I mean, there was a group, the Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy, that wanted to keep a statue there on UNC's campus. And Silent Sam, it was torn down by students and protesters right before I arrived on campus. And then they made this backdoor deal to house that thing in a museum and continue to clean it and glorify it. And that wasn't just Republicans, but that deal was also made by independents and even folks who lean to the left. So we need to get really serious about what justice and what equity look like. I'll also say this. I'm currently in Atlanta, Attorney Newhouse. I'm in law school at Emory. I just finished my first year. And so I see, thank you. I see what you're saying about Atlanta. In the suburban culture and the way that Georgia is in some ways like California, the way that California is in many ways like North Carolina now. You have these urban hubs, these cities where the young folks are, where there is some semblance of progressiveness or progression. But as soon as you travel outside those areas, you see folks who think so backwardly. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, went to school at UNC Chapel Hill, and then I worked, for a while in Durham. And so I kind of hit that triangle, that research triangle. And I just learned so much, and grew so much in those early days or stages of my life, Pam. And so now to be in law school, one of the main cases we learned, and Attorney Newhouse will appreciate this, one of the main cases we learned in our legislation and regulation class, or our admin law-esque class, was Chevron. And now they're going to have to rewrite the history books. I saw on Twitter or social media the other day that law school textbook writers are just sitting around smoking cigars today because they're about to pump out a whole new brand of textbooks because so much of what we learned has been unraveled. I mean, even the Dobbs decision, I was the first year of law students who had that in the textbook because Roe v. Wade was, the story for so long. And so to Professor Gershenhorn's point, I want to point out that being a child of North Carolina, there is so much history going back to the Civil Rights Act and the original Voting Rights Act. And there's so much history there in North Carolina. And I think the whole country can learn a lot. I mean, young people were on the front lines of history around the country, but specifically in North Carolina. A lot of people don't know, and again, Professor Gershenhorn alluded to this, that the environmental justice movement started in North Carolina, Warren County, North Carolina. I know Pam knows that. And so exactly, Dr. Benjamin Chavis. And so it's so important to note that young people have always been on the front lines of history. And I want to dispel a misconception before we move forward. Young people, at least myself and my peers, are willing to work with Gen X and with the boomer generation. We just want justice to prevail. We just want equity to be commonplace. And so, no, this is not an us versus them. This is not a they not like us, Drake versus Kendrick thing. We're just trying to get the justice that we all deserve. And it was so disheartening because I am working an internship this summer and I am, around federal law a lot. And so to see that decision on homelessness, to see some of these decisions handed down this past week. And of course, it's been mentioned on this call that Monday likely will get a decision on presidential immunity. It's so sad. It's so disheartening, especially for poor Americans. And we know that those Americans happen to be Black and brown disproportionately. So I'll just conclude by saying we talked a lot about Jim Crow and what is this new era that we're in. I think Stacey Abrams said it best. We are in a Jim Crow era where Jim is dressed up in a suit and a tie. I mean, there's not much that's changed. I know we've talked a little bit about the qualitative data. We've talked a little bit about the what I say visible change. We see more Black people in the position of CEOs and maybe more Black folks getting graduate degrees. But when we're talking about these historic, these generational, like the generational wealth gap, these issues, there hasn't been much change. We still see police brutality. We still see that large generational wealth gap. We still see Black maternal mortality rates and Black healthcare not being on the same level as that of white folks. And so, Pam, you and I did talk after the debate, and I was disheartened by both candidates' performances, to be honest. Of course, Biden didn't lie like Trump did, but it was hard to watch. I don't know anyone who's watched it who can't say it was hard to watch. But we are in the time right now where young people are itching. We're itching to lead. And so I think that right now what we need to do is organize on the grassroots level. And if they have to wheel Biden around in a wheelchair, I'm still voting for him in November because Trump is not going to take away any more of my rights. And his people are not going to fuel that fire that is burning up all of our rights and privileges and abilities to be free. So that's where I stand on most of this. And I'll just also mention that I think Attorney Newhouse is right. A lot of this language is boilerplate. What we see in Florida is then sent up to North Carolina, which is then sent down to Mississippi. And now we have the Bible being taught in schools, and those folks are 48th in the country in education and literacy level. I mean, come on, what are we talking about here? So we need to get on the same page. We need to get back to the community organizing structure and model and make sure young people are included in the conversation. And we need to vote. And we do need to elect people that do care about true justice and democracy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to list for you guys the 5 most important civil rights that's according to Google. And it all makes sense to me, Professor Gershenhorn. So you let me know if we're correct. And then we're going to talk briefly about something else. Free from discrimination, the freedom to worship as we choose, the right to vote, the protections of due process, and the right to privacy. And I can see where several of these have been intruded upon by what's going on, because free from discrimination, well, when you got rid of affirmative action and some other things like that, that's going to be a problem. Freedom to worship as we choose. If you've got the 10 commandments up in the school, and Johnny over here is Muslim, and Bendy over here is Hindu, what's that?
Teaching the Bible now in Oklahoma.
Right. So I mean, come on. And then the right to vote. Oh, geez, we could talk about that forever because the Voting Rights Act has been gutted and the John Lewis's act didn't go anywhere. The protections of due process, well, we've always had that problem, always. And the right to privacy with AI and all of this, who knows? So I mean, it's just like everything is up in smoke. Professor Gershenhorn, what does history say? Is there any?
Well, I think, I mean, I agree. Those are obviously very important, but I think one thing that comes to mind that it leaves out is, I don't know if people might recall, Franklin Roosevelt made what he called the Four Freedoms speech, and one was the freedom from want. You know, it leaves out economic. I mean, if you're starving, or if you're, I mean, you talk about unhoused people, if people who are economically, you know, disenfranchised, displaced, you know, which includes discrimination, but it also leaves out class, you know, the class issues. You know, some of you already have talked about, you know, the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton going back to the 90s. And, you know, you may remember he was the problem, one of the big problems that I see of the Democratic Party back then, and continued, although I think there's been some change on that scope recently, but that would be a longer conversation perhaps, but that they were in the pocket of corporations just as much as the Republicans.
Sure.
They were not doing hardly anything to help people at the bottom. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, mass incarceration, we haven't touched on that yet.
Oh,
and neoliberalism.
What did you say, Trevor?
Neoliberalism, right? Yeah.
Neoliberalism. And also, Pam, like something I said right at the top of the show that we have to be careful of when you're identifying the five civil rights there. I mean, I don't disagree with the concept, but I think we have to be very much aware of nowadays. And I'm speaking, like, again, as someone who makes my living writing for thought leaders and as a strategic communications person, is that we have to be careful of who's defining what. You know, because what we call freedom and liberty, what we call the right to vote, MAGA and Trump Republicans, you know, they're using that very same language to undermine our basic civil rights. A perfect example, right down in Florida, Florida has a governor who is literally a fascist, literally by textbook definition of a fascist, and he's calling this Freedom Summer, where it's basically an assault. You know, he has his minions with an assault on the freedoms of his own citizens, calling it so using the language of the civil rights of the civil rights movement to attack the basic civil and human rights of his own citizens. And so and Attorney Newhouse and all the rest, and Greer and Gershon, all of us know that the reason why the far right is winning in the courts now is because they're turning civil rights laws on its head. They're using the 14th Amendment to argue that Black students shouldn't be given an opportunity, you know, an equal footing to get into college because it's discriminatory against white.
That's right.
They're using the 1865 Civil Rights Act, 13th Amendment, you know, which explicitly identified African Americans, you know, needing specific, you know, to be specifically addressed, their issues addressed, using that, you know, to call for color blindness, which by default, you know, favors the whites who have controlled the system, you know, and to argue that there's no systemic discrimination, you know, and so, but again, when you look at the white media, and I call it's the white media. You know, I was a senior editor at the largest Black newspaper in Michigan. You know, wrote for Black magazines almost my entire career. Apparently, I was writing for these white newspapers. They're generically different. You know, when it comes to writing about issues to return to civil rights and human rights and these kind of sociological things affecting African Americans. And the white media just concedes stuff. A perfect example, and I'll let you go because I know, is that when you had that bizarre mess that they called debate the other day, and they Trump talking about black jobs and brown. Did you see Jake Tapper or Danny Bash say, "Whoa, wait a minute, could you please define that?"
That's what they should have done. That they should have asked them, "What is a black job?" I wish Biden had it together instead of having his mouth gapped open in shock. I wish he could. What's a black job?
Before you even
but they don't have the capacity. I mean, what I would suggest to you is they do not have the capacity because, again, it's the who's defining what that Trevor started the conversation with, because the who and the what are what's critical that creates this divide. You have Kansas Supreme Court just deciding 2 weeks ago, voting is really not considered a right.
Yeah.
Now, how long before you think the rest of these states are going to pick up that
Who
language?
said that?
The
Kansas Supreme Court has ruled that voting is not a fundamental right. Now, how long before Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas,
Says I just listed it as one of the 5 most important civil rights.
and Kansas Supreme Court just said to you 2 weeks ago, no, it is not.
Okay.
So how long before you think that language is going to migrate? That language is now going to migrate to these other states.
Yeah.
And then somebody here who is in what people can, again, with New York and California, we're not necessarily as blue, if we want to use that as context, as it is believed, because all of these enclaves, the legislatures who are supporting or representing those citizens from their particular small rural communities or very tightly now defined MAGA communities, are going to then take this same legislation.
Right.
So you're going to see the same language from Kansas City's Supreme Court ruling from this lawsuit. It was to overturn a 2021 election law that they have now decided. Now, how much this is going to be challenged, we know it should be, but in the current climate, this is the point. See, the cruelty is the point. And that title of that book was so apropos. The cruelty is the point. This rollback of civil rights really has always been under attack and compromise, because if you look at, we just acknowledged and commemorated, I wouldn't say celebrated, Juneteenth. Well, part of the rationale behind even the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln deciding that the Southern states, to come back into the Union, needed to then outlaw enslavement. The Northern states could keep their humans in bondage. So even in 1865, free-ish might be a more apt description. Because if you were in a Northern state, you didn't have to release those humans that you had in captivity. It was only the compromise of coming back into the Union for the Southern states who were part of the Confederacy. And then little by little, everything that they were mandated to do to come back into the Union, and Lincoln's assassination, because Lincoln was like essentially not necessarily the stalwart about anti-enslavement in so much as the desire to keep the Union together. So that's why Reconstruction prematurely ended. That's why Reconstruction does not seem to reverberate in any capacity that has had any staying power, where everything that we now know from Reconstruction seems to still have elements, residual residue of the Confederacy. And now we're seeing that again in the generations who are the sons and daughters of the Confederates, because they will take an L for a battle. They are here for the war.
That's right. That's right. I think that's so true. If I could jump in here, and that's what I think, that's the issue. And I think Brother Coleman is exactly right. We need to redefine who's asking these questions. We also need to be clear about who has access to certain things. They're cutting off access for certain people. They're cutting off access to knowledge for Black and brown folks who are going to make up soon, if they don't already, the majority of public schools, K-12 in the country. They don't want us to know about ourselves and these fights for freedom that our ancestors engaged in. And I'm sorry I keep turning to the side. It's because I'm looking at this book by Roland Martin called White Fear, How the Browning of America is Making White People Lose Their Minds. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. The cruelty is the point, because these people are running scared, because the world as a whole is already majority brown, and America is becoming that way. America is becoming that way. So I think Attorney Newhouse is spot on. Brother Coleman is spot on in that Black media is so inherently different than white media. And we need to shout out people like Pam, people like Roland Martin, the people in this chat who are fueling this show, who say we need to go viral, because we do. We need to have more of these conversations.
Share this video, guys, because the only reason why I even started this channel in the first place is because I got tired of airboxing the television and the radio, because I stay mad all the time about something happening with Trump. I can't even remember what happened. And then I said, I'm going to do this or whatever. And then I did it, and it exhausts me all of the time. I cannot tell you, but
Yes.
I get energized once we start going, and I think, okay, it wasn't so bad. All of the back work to it. So if you can share this, like and thumbs up the videos, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, because the algorithm is a beast on YouTube. It is a beast.
Yes,
And
it is.
the only way for Google to say that people are listening, people are reading, whatever, is you have to show activity on YouTube. It's great for my other places where you all are listening, but I stream those other places only to have audience, because I have people there, whereas I don't have it so much on
Yes.
YouTube.
And so I just wanted to make those points and say, and I know we're here at 9 o'clock, and I'm sure you have some specific topics, Pam, but incorporating some of what I've seen in the chat, this is really the point I was trying to make at the jump, with all of those different topics coming into one. There is a concerted effort from conservatives in the United States right now to do all of this unraveling.
Yes.
We see it at the Supreme Court level, where it's bribes for me, but not for thee. We see it at the state legislature level, where they are boilerplating these laws. We see it at the K-12 level, where people like Mark Robinson, who's the Republican candidate for governor in North Carolina, is attacking LGBTQ folks and public school teachers, and saying all of this, and just throwing out your children, your kids, to fearmonger. And the cruelty is the point, yes, but also instilling fear in people, as Brother Roland Martin says, is the point. And so when we talk about Project 2025, which was mentioned in the chat,
that was the next thing I was going to bring up.
Okay, go ahead, Pam. Ask away, because that's important to talk about.
May I tag before we shift real quick, Pam? Because it ties up all of the points with respect to access. Roland's book, because of its title, not because of its truth, because of its title, has been blocked from so many media spaces. Because this prediction, Roland's been saying this for 10 years on his show.
And not just Roland, it was said before. I remember.
Absolutely.
BJ.
Absolutely. The White Fear. Absolutely.
Who wrote that book? The Tanning of America.
Oh, yes. That book.
Remember that? It was at the 2011. You weren't there, but it was at the 2011 NABJ thing. He had a whole panel, and that was the first time I remember somebody addressing it nationally. But at the 2011 NABJ conference in Philadelphia, there was a brother there, and he's a big time brother. But I can't think he does like entertainment shows.
Steve Stout.
Okay.
Steve Stout. Yeah, because hip hop is kind of his foundation. But yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
He did that book, The Tanning of America. And it may have gotten more play than Roland.
Yes. And I think it helped because he had that hip hop foundation and that connection.
Yeah.
So he had that credibility amongst a bigger audience of people who were listening to him in one space and then were able to connect to him in that space. But I cannot tell you the number of times where Roland has said that he has not been interviewed when his book dropped, because the white facing media was very determined that they were objecting to the title, and they didn't want to offend anyone with the title. Meanwhile, we're being offended by the assault on our existence, which I find so fascinating, that is not what the media is spending more opportunity to dissect and to address, because it has become an assault. The way all of these state legislatures are rolling out policy, the way that they're rolling them out to do test cases while they have this particular Supreme Court, because leading into their manifesto of 2025.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Well,
It's the same way. Before I know Brother Coleman was about to jump in too. I just wanted to say it's the same way that they're pushing out Don Lemon and Tiffany Cross, but then they're hiring Ronna McDaniel on
oh,
NBC to show both sides. And you know, of course, she's not there anymore because they outcry. It's exactly that, right? Black people are always bottom of the barrel when it comes to white-facing media. That's all I wanted to say.
yeah.
And there are no two sides if you tell me water is not wet. I'm not able to have that conversation with you.
What were you going to say, Trevor?
Yeah, and also this also kind of plays into the whole Project 2025. As I told you, when I was a civil rights reporter, it's kind of a hybrid kind of posture I took because I was also investigative, right? But I investigated civil rights and I investigated like these white far right organizations. I thought it's easy to write about the Klan, write about the Federalist Society. That's what you need to look into. And so I wrote about them. And I won awards for NABJ and all kinds of writing about these guys. The point I'm making though is that back, you mentioned in Kansas where the Supreme Court said that the right to vote is not guaranteed, or you don't have a right to vote, right? But the thing is that this has been an argument on a subterranean level for decades by the right wing because the Constitution explicitly state that we have the right to vote. And in a U.S. Supreme Court case in the 90s, I forgot the name of the case. Maybe Attorney Newhouse knows, up and coming Attorney Webb certainly can find it. But it's somewhere in the 90s, it was a voting rights case, which I think they may have upheld 5-4, in favor of the Legal Defense Fund. But Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia made that argument that it was not guaranteed in the Supreme Court. And so people said, I was watching it, we need to keep an eye on that because what they were doing even back then, and when it's much more explicit, flagrant nowadays, is that they leave breadcrumbs for the far right extremists to follow, and then they change the infrastructure over the years because they're patient by putting all these far right racist judges in place. So again, they play the long game. They tell just like in the recent case with the abortion case, okay, they're not going to deal with it right now because they don't want to deal with an election year, and they don't want to, motivate women as much as right now to vote because of the Dobbs decision. But we won't deal with this. We'll put it off. But here, this is what you need to do. You need to come back. Where you have standing sort of things, right? And so what they said in that particular case in the 90s, that voting rights case, where they talked about, they just kind of make this intellectual argument, for that proposition, and then people take a hold of, Progressive did that too over the years. I mean, when it comes to civil rights law, they said there's an opening here, and then once you get more friendly judges, I mean, so they both do it, but it's not the same morally because one is for embracing the humanity and the citizenship of all of our fellow citizens, and the other is to emasculate the citizenship and the humanity of people. So what I'm saying is that just like Attorney Newhouse was saying, how this is like a not cookie cutter, but this is like something that they're looking at. So with that Kansas case, because always kind of the most extreme, because that's who they are. These people these aren't traditional conservative judges. These are political activists. They don't like us because we're not white. They don't like Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas is one of the most hateful racists to ever sit on the Supreme Court. Judge Leon Higginbotham, who used to be the chief judge of the Third Circuit, who's a very good friend of mine. I interviewed him. We talked. We used to engage him when I covered the court stuff. Right? He said, and he even wrote it in his book, White Justice, Black Rose. I forget the name of the book off my head. White Justice, Black Rose is just Bruce Wright. But the point I'm making, just Leon Higginbotham said that Clarence Thomas was the most racist Supreme Court justice to sit in the court since Justice McReynolds, who was a Klan member. Who's
black, prejudice against his own. How sad!
Self-hate. It's not that. It's a deep, egregious self-hate.
Of course, it's right.
Self-hate to the nth degree.
But the point I'm making though is that Thomas and Scalia, and now it used to be in Rehnquist were like way out there, but now you have 6 judges. There's no difference between. People think because Amy Coney Barrett may speak with softer tone. There's no difference between her and Clarence Thomas when it comes to our rights. And she's about as representative of mainstream thought of women as Clarence Thomas is of black folks. You know?
Right.
So
How many black children has she adopted from Haiti?
Which is terrifying. Which is terrifying.
So the point I'm making though is that watch this Kansas case. Watch these organized right wingers take this Kansas case, you know, and make it end up in the federal courts. It work its way up to the Supreme Court, you know, and you will probably have, even as of today, a minimum of 5 votes, you know, for the or if not explicitly endorse, you know, that concept. You know, even I wouldn't be surprised because they attacked the Voting Rights Act, they obliterated it, at least embrace it to the extent that they further undermine what remains of the Voting Rights Act, where it's just totally, utterly meaningless now, that the DOJ can't even use it to protect the most basic rights.
Right.
So it's
wobble. It's toddling at this point because it's been gutted so systematically. Right. But all of these test cases statewide are to match up with the tenets of the Project 2025.
Right.
When I say that this is calculated, the day after 1965's passing of the voter rights legislation, the entirety of the package between the housing and what should have been some economic opportunities, all of the minds and what we're seeing now is the manifestation of their descendants who are carrying on their angst, disgust, retribution, all of what we're seeing now. And again, these are all tenets that are in Project 2025. So dismantling voting, dismantling education, dismantling access, whether it's economic or it is jobs or careers, or not just access to education at the public level, in the public school K through 12 level, but demolishing opportunities that would get access to higher education, systematically ensuring that now you cannot be unhoused without being yourself, your status being a crime. Right. So that means 13th Amendment, that means anti-slavery, save for what? Prison. So now we can use those bodies any way that we want to use those bodies, because now we can just scoop up people that are sleeping. So if I'm between jobs, and nobody can tell me that anybody in this country works harder than the poor with 2 and 3 jobs. There's no corporate executive that works harder than the poor with 2 and 3 jobs. You're in between jobs. You don't want to go home and fall asleep because the distance is too far. So in between the jobs, you want to be on time so that you can keep that 2nd or 3rd job. You sleep in your car just to catch a nap before you enter your next job. Now you can be arrested for that, fined, or jailed.
Right.
And this also
and
means
the judge and the justice was so flippant about it day before yesterday in saying, well, it's just a fine.
Right. And this also means the return of debtor prisons, which the ACLU had been warned about.
Exactly. But those debtor prisons means corporate free labor.
Absolutely.
Corporate free labor.
Right.
That's what those debtor prisons means. And I think we don't understand this because, as was said earlier, it's been so romanticized because, again, when somebody takes your foot off your back, you're just glad your face isn't in the mud anymore. But you still haven't stood up. You still haven't been able to access some kind of system of dignity. You're just glad your face isn't in the mud. And what's happened now is all of that is now being snatched away, and it's being done systematically in our faces. And we're not understanding, again, that this is a plan. They're so comfortable that we know Project 2025 exists.
Right. Right. Can I do this, Pam, real quick? Because I saw you.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna read the pillars real quick. It's 4 pillars, because I see people in the chat saying, we keep saying Project 2025, but some folks.
And I shared the screen, but you guys wouldn't let me get in and say anything. You want me to share the screen?
Apologies.
You can, but I'm at this summary document that has the 4 pillars. I didn't see the 4 pillars, but I did see you sharing your screen, and I see that the leaders of this are also leaders in the Heritage Foundation.
Right. That's what I wanted to tell you.
Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society are coupled up.
Right. So the first pillar for those listening or watching is called Mandate for Leadership. That's the first pillar. That's the name of a book, and it represents the first pillar of strategy, they say. And this book is almost 900 pages long with in-depth explanations and recommendations for what the federal government should do. That's pillar one. Pillar two is called People or Policy. It talks about how they can specifically target people and make people feel a certain type of way so that they will support this agenda. And this second pillar aims to create a database of at least 10,000 people that can basically be manipulated into agreeing with this strategy. Pillar three is called Training. And this document says Project 2025 does not just intend to compile a list of strong potential appointees or people, but it also aims to train people for the jobs that they would take under a conservative administration. That's three, training. Number fourth and finally is executive orders. Project 2025, we are compiling an appendix to equip a future conservative president with conservative policy to be passed down through executive orders. So people really need to understand, and I'll hush after this, that those are the full four pillars, and it is a concerted effort. It is a strategy. And I think Brother Coleman mentioned this earlier, but if not, I'll say it. Whether or not Trump gets elected in November of this year, this thing is going to keep going. It may have been Attorney Newhouse. They're going to keep going with Project 2025. And we need to understand that this is not a red versus blue thing. This is they're trying to take away my rights. I'm trying to live. I'm trying not to be criminalized for being poor, for living outside, for wanting to stand up for myself, for protesting against endless wars. This is a concerted effort and it needs to be talked about. And so I'm glad that this is the platform to do so, Pam. And I know it was either you or Professor Gershenhorn were going to maybe tie this to history, because these four pillars sound eerily similar to other things.
Eerily similar to something that happened with the guy with the funny kind of mustache. And
I wasn't even going that direction, but yes.
Well, it sounds like Third Reichish kind of stuff to me.
Well, sure. And let me just share something that's really important, particularly for those of color, particularly for Black men. Right. That's also that's a central tenet of this Project 25. And everybody needs to listen up and listen good and share this with your family members. Right. Another major component of this project, right, is to militarize urban communities, to send the military for security reasons into places like Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, New York. The government send them in. Not the governors don't. The governors don't have to ask for it. Trump
it's already happening.
Send them in. Right. So you think mass incarceration was bad during the 90s, right? This is to basically send the military in to surround these communities, surround these urban centers with armed military to use that violence against people who might be protesting for their human rights, who might be protesting, for the rights of poor people, protesting for the right of housing or education, or protesting against police brutality. And remember, he also wants to immunize all police, against any kind of accountability, for assault. So basically he must indemnify the police, for police brutality. He wants to send the troops, not just Trump, but this whole Project 25 is to send the U.S. military armies into these urban centers. He's not going to be sending them to Salt Lake City. He's going to be sending them to Cheney, Wyoming. He's going to send them to Philadelphia, to New York City, Chicago, Detroit, Miami.
And this is what Cop City is essentially about in Atlanta. Why would Cop City be in Atlanta?
And he wants them to kill us. Remember, Trump's own staff said, when they were protesting during the summer of 20 with George Floyd, he said, why can't we shoot him in the legs? And another person said, Trump asked, why can't you shoot him in the head? Trump and those people hate our guts.
Brother Coleman, where was this energy to send troops in on January 6th in D.C.?
He said for how long? And we couldn't get any help while the police officers got killed and maimed and all of that.
Remember what Trump said, in the investigation before the congressional investigation. He said, he told them, the Secret Service, let them go through. They're not going to shoot me.
Right.
They're going to shoot, maybe Nancy Pelosi, that kind of thing. I mean, he that's why he wanted them to go through. But this all of what you're saying is why it's so important no matter who is the Republican candidate for any congressional office, any state legislative office. I mean, I hear about Larry Hogan, the supposedly moderate in Maryland.
Yeah.
That it's so important that he is defeated, because if the Republicans control the Congress, they will push this thing right through.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would like to say, I have really, because language is just so critical to understanding, to messaging, to narration, I often feel like it is important to call a thing when it comes to this being MAGA. It's not just because again, early on, like it was stated, conservative are values that for the majority of generations of Black people and African Americans, our social peer positioning and posture has almost always been conservative socially. Right. But when we say conservative, it gets to swallow that up. What we are seeing now is not about conservatism. This is about MAGA zealots. MAGA zealots. Right. And that is what is driving the audience members for Project 2025, because what those people don't tend to understand, the majority of those people who don't reside in the 1%, is all of this is going to affect them as well.
Well, listen, guys, it is 9:20. And we have gone on and on. We could go on. Listen, I think what I'm probably going to do is do a separate show on Project 2025, because it is just that's mind-blowing in and of itself. It's very concerning. But one thing that really got me about them is that they have this 180-day plan. I mean, they've got, that thing is so rigorous, their plan and stuff. And it's scary. It's really quite insidious. But I have oh look, yes, part two.
I know people want us to run this back.
Yes. Listen, you guys, please share this video. Please share this video with your friends and family and all that good stuff. And if America was like China, what is this? I don't know who this David Carr is.
That's my cousin. Now watch.
Okay.
He's a military veteran. This is progressive, man. He's radical. Cousin Dave.
He kept saying different things, and I couldn't tell. One thing he said, I was like, I don't know what you're saying there. But anyways.
But look, Pam, to his credit, he did say one thing earlier that I wanted to use as my concluding thoughts. He said that when we begin to put individualism over community and society, then we've really lost. And that's really what this is all about, is making people think they can live life on their own. No, we have to do this. We have to do this life thing together. And young people are willing to work with other generations. We just need that access. And I'll say some young people need to do a better job of listening. But as I said earlier, young people have always been on the front lines of history, organizing and working together. Right. We live in a country, which means we live in a community. And to David's point, we can't do any of this on our own. And so when people start telling you, you can do it on your own, here's the playbook for you to become powerful with no help, that's when you know they're up to no good.
Yeah. Freedom isn't free. David is still outstanding. Oh, thank you, John Cameron. I think that's one of and Vicky Suggs is the reason why this show exists today, because this was her suggestion.
Hey, Vicky.
Professor Vicky Suggs at North Carolina Central University, Department of Mass Communications. That's my girl. That's my sister.
That's my fraternity brothers, Sydney Rose Alpha A Phi in the house.
Oh, Sydney? That okay? Hey, Sydney. He's looking forward to part 2. Well, listen. Oh, Vicky Hager. Well, listen, guys. I have enjoyed you all so much. I guess I have to call y'all back, because we'll have to do a part 2, and which means, Professor, you'll have to do some analysis about the comparison of what Project 25 is in relation to what it was back in the day, or some other fascist countries or something, or whatever. I don't know. Learning so much, listening to you all. Looking forward to part 2. Hey, Pamela. I haven't talked to her in so long. Yeah.
Hey, Pam, can I just add something real quick to what you were saying? Gershenhorn, and I'll do this myself. Now, remember, in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Warmth of Other Suns, she writes about basically how the United States was a role model for Nazism and also for the South African apartheid system.
The Nuremberg laws.
Nuremberg laws that were based upon the Jim Crow and the Black Codes. They came over here and studied, the way they were oppressing African Americans, and in fact, they thought we were rather extreme. And then they went. They thought we were.
They said that it was so cruel they would not implement certain tenets of the Black Codes and some of the other enslavement laws because of the cruelty.
Exactly.
And given what we think now in modern day of the Hitler regime, imagine that being the perspective.
Right. And Donald Trump has an obsession with Hitler, and many of these people behind Project 2025 have that shit. They're connected. If you look, I told you I did investigative work. If you look deep into they have connections with these far right movements in Hungary, in Eastern Europe. I mean, they come from the same place. They occupy the same intellectual, ideological space. These people are basically, they're the modern day Nazi movements. And instead of the target being Jews for the moment, it's Black people and brown people to a lesser degree, but it's going to be brown people. But the fact is, many brown people like Cubans can try to get away with this white, this whole kind of identifying as white and white by extension, this sort of stuff.
Or white Hispanic checkbox.
Yeah. But specifically, the targets have always been Black folks, right? And so, and don't think for a second this whole idea about sending the military into these communities where proportion of that they're not thinking the concept is basically concentration camps to get us organized and in one spot, where they can focus the suppression and persecution of us. I mean, and that's no exaggeration. I mean, that's what.
No, Steve Bannon wrote the playbook that they are now utilizing.
Right, that's the logical conclusion, of what they're planning on doing if we allow that. So we have to be organized, and we have to be very aggressive about telling them we know what they're trying to do. And because Joe Biden, isn't exactly the most articulate person because he is old. He doesn't make you hold your breath.
He has a speech impediment.
Right, but the point is, there's no other alternative to this. We just have to be realistic what we're dealing with here.
That's right. We have to be realistic. And so on that note, Pam, I know you're trying to wrap up because I need some sleep before I go to my Black job tomorrow.
Me too. Yeah. But listen, we will do this again. I thank you all so much, my panelists. I thank the chat. You guys have been a great audience. You guys have really participated so well, and we'll do a part 2, but the next time we'll focus on Project 2025. Okay. All right.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
It was excellent to be with you. Thank you so very much.
All right. Good night, everybody.